The Duke swept the halls in disguise, and learned she wanted the title, not him. The Duke swept the halls in disguise, and learned she wanted the title, not him. Lady Alara Vance stood before the great, unyielding oak doors of Blackwood Manor, her hands clenched so tightly within her worn gloves that her knuckles ached. Rain, a fine, weeping mist that had pursued her carriage for the last 50 miles, clung to her cloak and dampened her spirit. Before her stood a fortress of granite and shadow, a place that seemed to absorb the very light from the sky. This was to be her new home, her gilded cage, the price of her family's salvation. The man who owned it, the Duke of Blackwood, was a ghost, a name whispered in London parlors with a mixture of fear and fascination. A recluse, scarred by some past tragedy, who had purchased her sight unseen, as one might purchase a broodmare. The doors opened not with a welcoming swing, but with a reluctant groan, revealing a severe-faced steward whose expression was as grim as the weather. "Lady Alara," he intoned, his voice devoid of warmth. "His Grace is indisposed. He has been called away on urgent ducal matters. I am Mr. Finch. I will show you to your chambers." Indisposed. It was a dismissal before she had even crossed the threshold. A cold knot of humiliation tightened in her stomach. She was a parcel, delivered and now awaiting the owner's convenience. She followed Finch through cavernous halls where portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her with accusing eyes. The air was still and cold, heavy with the scent of beeswax and old stone and something else, loneliness. It was a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture. Her own footsteps, soft as they were, echoed like intrusions. In the west wing, she was granted a suite of rooms that were opulent yet cheerless. A fire had been laid in the hearth but not lit. The damask curtains were drawn tight against the dreary day. "His Grace has left instructions that you are to have the run of the estate," Finch said, his gaze flicking over her simple traveling dress with faint disapproval. "Within reason. The Duke's private wing is, of course, forbidden." He paused. "Dinner is at 8. Alone." He bowed stiffly and departed, the click of the closing door sealing her into her new reality. Alara sank onto the edge of a chaise lounge, the silk cool beneath her. Alone. She had expected a cold welcome from a husband she did not know, but she had not anticipated being so utterly and immediately erased. She was a non-entity, a placeholder for the title of Duchess. A bitter smile touched her lips. Well, what had she expected? This was a bargain, a contract of land for title. Her father's crumbling estate for the security of a ducal coronet. Love and affection were not part of the transaction. From a high, mullioned window, hidden behind a tapestry depicting a grim hunting scene, Alastair, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, watched her. He was not away on ducal business. He was here, dressed in the rough-spun tunic and worn leather breeches of a simple groundskeeper. His hands, usually accustomed to the weight of a signet ring and the smooth vellum of official documents, were calloused and bare. A smear of dirt was deliberately smudged along his jaw, obscuring the faint, silvery scar that ran from his temple to the corner of his mouth, a permanent reminder of a past trust, brutally broken. He had concocted this ruse with Finch, his only true confidant, out of the bitter dregs of cynicism. His first fiancée, a celebrated beauty, had sworn undying love until the moment a wealthier marquis had appeared on the scene. She had not only broken their engagement but had done so with a cruel laugh, mocking the very scar he'd earned defending her honor in a foolish duel. He had learned his lesson then. They did not want the man Alastair. They wanted the Duke of Blackwood. They wanted the power, the prestige, the jewels. They would tolerate the scarred, reclusive man who came with it all, but they would never truly see him. And so he would test this one, this Lady Alara Vance, whose father was so deep in debt he'd practically sold her. Alastair would be Caleb, a quiet man who worked the grounds. He would watch her, listen to her, and see the truth for himself. He expected to find a vacuous, grasping creature, obsessed with gowns and status. He would give her a month to reveal her true colors, and then he would end the charade, pay off her father's debts to be rid of the obligation, and send her packing. The thought gave him a grim, hollow satisfaction. He had built walls around his heart so high and so thick that no one could ever breach them again. He would ensure they remained unbreached. He watched as she finally rose and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. For a moment, her face was illuminated by the weak gray light. It was a quiet face, not classically beautiful, but possessed of a strength in the set of her jaw and a deep, sorrowful intelligence in her wide gray eyes. She stared out at the rain-soaked gardens, her expression unreadable. He saw her shoulders lift in a deep sigh, a gesture of profound weariness that pricked at something deep within him, an old, forgotten chord of empathy. He ruthlessly suppressed it. Pity was a weakness he could not afford. She was here for his title. He would prove it, and in proving it, he would reaffirm the bitter truth that had become the cornerstone of his existence. He was, and would always be, utterly alone. The next morning, the rain had ceased, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. Alara, desperate for air and an escape from the suffocating opulence of her rooms, ventured out into the gardens. She found a section of the grounds that was clearly neglected, a once beautiful rose garden now choked with weeds, its stone benches slick with moss. It felt like a reflection of her own life, a place of forgotten potential. She knelt, heedless of the damp earth staining her simple muslin dress, and gently pulled a clinging vine from a struggling rosebush. Its thorns pricked her finger, and she brought it to her lips, a small, sharp sting of reality in this dreamlike prison. "You'll ruin your hands, milady." The voice was low and rough, startling her. She looked up to see a man standing nearby, a pruning shear in his hand. He was tall and broadly built, with dark, unruly hair that fell across his brow. He was dressed as a common laborer, but he held himself with an uncommon stillness, a coiled tension that seemed at odds with his station. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. A faint scar traced a line down the side of his face, disappearing into the shadow of his jaw. "I have ruined them long ago," she replied, her voice steady as she looked down at her own hands, which were far from the soft, useless appendages of a society belle. They were capable hands, familiar with mending, baking, and gardening. "These roses are being strangled. They need help," he grunted, a non-committal sound. The Duke cares little for the gardens. He cares little for anything, or so they say. There was a challenge in his tone, a test. Alara felt a flash of defensiveness on behalf of the man she was to marry, a stranger who had already dismissed her. "Perhaps he has other things on his mind," she said softly. The man's mouth twisted into a cynical smirk. "Or perhaps he simply has no mind for beauty." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "You are the one he is to marry, then? The one to be the new Duchess?" She rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her skirt. There was an insolence in his gaze she found both irritating and intriguing. He did not bow or scrape. He looked at her as an equal, and there was a judgment in his eyes that she felt compelled to defy. "I am Lady Alara," she said, her chin lifting. "And you are?" "Caleb," he said, the name sounding clipped and foreign on his tongue. "I work the grounds." "Well, Caleb," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "it seems you and I will be working them together. I intend to save this garden." Alistair Caleb was taken aback. He had expected her to recoil, to summon Finch and complain about the impertinence of a servant. Instead, she had declared her intention to work, to dirty her hands. He watched as she turned back to the roses, her brow furrowed in concentration. This was not the behavior of the grasping socialite he had anticipated. It was unexpected. He remained silent, observing her, the pruning shears suddenly heavy in his hand. The test had begun, but its subject was already refusing to behave as predicted. A flicker of something that felt dangerously like interest sparked within his cold, guarded heart. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Each morning, Alara would escape to the neglected rose garden. And each morning, Caleb would be there, ostensibly working on a nearby hedge or path, his presence a constant, silent observation. He said little, offering only gruff, monosyllabic answers to her questions about the soil or the best way to train a climbing vine. Yet, he always seemed to be there when she needed him, his strong hands effortlessly loosening a stubborn root ball or lifting a heavy stone she could not manage on her own. Alistair found himself in a state of perpetual conflict. His mind, the cynical Duke, catalogued her every action as part of an elaborate performance. She is merely playing the part of the humble, hard-working lady, he would tell himself. A ploy to win favor with the staff, to build a narrative of her own virtue that will surely reach my ears. But his heart, the reluctant observer, saw something else entirely. He saw the genuine frustration in her eyes when a prized cutting failed to take root. He saw the gentle way she spoke to the robins that flitted about the garden, and the unconscious grace in her movements as she worked, her face smudged with dirt, her hair escaping its neat pins. One afternoon, he watched from the shadows of an ancient yew tree as her lady's maid, a nervous young woman named Agnes, brought out a tray of tea. "My lady, you shouldn't be doing this," Agnes fretted, wringing her hands as she looked at Alara's soiled dress. "What will his grace think when he returns, to find you looking like a common milkmaid?" Alistair leaned forward, his senses sharp. This was it, the moment of truth. Alara sat back on her heels and accepted the cup of tea, her smile weary but genuine. "His grace will think what he wishes, Agnes. But this," she gestured to the rows of cleared earth and pruned bushes, "this is something real, something I can mend with my own hands. In this place, I am not merely waiting. I am creating." She took a sip of tea, her gaze distant. "Besides, the Duke did not bargain for a gardener. He bargained for a duchess. I must do everything in my power to become one he will not cast aside. My family's future depends on me securing that title." Alistair's heart turned to ice. There it was, the raw, unvarnished truth. Securing that title. The words echoed in his mind, a bitter confirmation of all his fears. The garden, the gentle smiles, the kindness to the birds. It was all a means to an end. The end was the Blackwood coronet. A cold fury settled over him. He had almost allowed himself to be fooled. He had almost begun to hope. He stepped back into the shadows, the sound of her words a poison in his veins. The game was not over, but he knew with chilling certainty how it would end. He became colder to her after that, his silence more pointed, his assistance more grudging. He wanted to drive her away, to make her so uncomfortable she would retreat to her gilded cage and reveal the pampered creature he knew her to be. But Alara was not so easily deterred. She seemed not to notice his changed demeanor, or if she did, she attributed it to the natural surliness of a man like him. She continued her work, her quiet determination a constant, infuriating presence. One day, while attempting to brace a crumbling section of the stone wall that bordered the garden, she slipped. A heavy flagstone dislodged, tumbling toward her foot. Before she could even cry out, Caleb moved with a speed that was astonishing for a man of his size. He lunged, shoving her aside and taking the brunt of the falling stone across his own forearm. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and stumbled back, clutching his arm. Blood welled instantly, dark and crimson against the pale skin. "Caleb!" Alara rushed to his side, her own fear forgotten. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he growled, his face pale and tight with pain. He tried to pull away, but she was insistent. "Don't be a fool. Let me see." With surprising strength, she took his arm, her touch gentle but firm. She ripped a long strip of fabric from the hem of her own petticoat, a clean, white linen, and began to wrap the wound with practiced efficiency. "We need to get you to the kitchens. This will need stitches." He stared at her, stunned into silence. Her face was inches from his, her expression one of pure, unadulterated concern. There was no revulsion at the sight of his blood, no delicate swooning. There was only a fierce, practical competence. Her fingers were deft and sure as she tied the makeshift bandage, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through his entire body that had nothing to do with his injury. "I can manage," he said, his voice hoarse. "You will do no such thing," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. She slid her shoulder under his good arm, taking on a portion of his weight. "You will lean on me, and I will help you to the house. You were injured protecting me. It is the least I can do." As they limped toward the manor, Alistair was reeling. He had thrown himself in front of the stone on pure instinct, the instinct of a man sworn to protect, not the calculated move of a groundskeeper. And her reaction, it was not the reaction of a woman who saw him as a mere servant. She had tended to him with the same focus and care she gave her roses. As she supported him, her brow furrowed with worry. He was acutely aware of her proximity, of the scent of rain and earth that clung to her. He was leaning on Lady Alara Vance, the woman who wanted his title, and for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his own deception. He had orchestrated this test to prove she was false, but all he was learning was how profoundly he was lying to her. The incident with the falling stone shifted the delicate balance between them. In the days that followed, as Caleb's arm healed, a new, fragile intimacy began to bloom in the quiet confines of the rose garden. Alara insisted on changing his dressing each morning, her touch gentle and professional. During these moments, a heavy silence would fall, thick with unspoken thoughts. Alistair, forced into stillness, found himself watching her, truly watching her, for the first time without the lens of his cynicism. He saw the way a stray curl would catch the sunlight, turning it to spun gold. He noticed the faint spray of freckles across the bridge of her nose, invisible from a distance. He learned the language of her expressions, the small furrow between her brows when she was concentrating, the soft curve of her lips when a new rosebud showed its first hint of color. These were the details of a person, not a caricature. The lines between Alara, the title hunter, and Alara, the woman kneeling before him, began to blur. One cool evening, a sudden downpour trapped them in an old, abandoned groundskeeper's cottage at the far end of the garden. The air grew cold quickly. With an efficiency that spoke of long practice, Caleb built a fire in the dusty hearth, the flames slowly pushing back the damp and shadows. Alara sat on an overturned crate, hugging her arms around herself for warmth. "You seem to know your way around a fire," she remarked, her voice soft in the crackling quiet. "A man learns to keep himself warm," he replied, his gaze fixed on the flames. The firelight played across his face, softening the harsh lines and illuminating the silver of his scar. He felt strangely exposed, stripped of his ducal authority and his carefully constructed disguise, reduced to nothing more than a man sharing a small, warm space with a woman. "Tell me about your scar, Caleb," she asked suddenly, her voice gentle, not demanding. "If it's not too painful to speak of." Alistair's entire body went rigid. The scar was the one thing that was truly his, a physical manifestation of his deepest wound, the betrayal that had shaped him. He had never spoken of it to anyone, not even Finch. But here, in the flickering firelight, with this woman whose motives he was supposed to despise, he felt an unexpected urge to share a piece of the truth. Not the whole truth, but a piece. "It was a long time ago," he began, his voice lower than usual. I trusted someone, a friend. I thought we were like brothers. But he betrayed that trust for the sake of a wager. A stupid, meaningless bet over a horse. He was editing the story, replacing his fiancée with a friend, the duel over her honor with a common brawl over a wager. But the core of it, the betrayal, was real. The pain was real. I learned a valuable lesson that day, that people will always serve their own interests first. Trust is a currency for fools. He fell silent, bracing himself for her pity or, worse, her dismissal. Instead, Alara was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I don't think trust is foolish," she said, looking not at him, but into the heart of the fire. I think it's the bravest thing a person can do, to offer your heart to someone, knowing they have the power to break it. The man who betrayed you was the fool, Caleb. Not you. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't pitying him. She was defending him. She was defending the man he used to be, the man who had trusted so freely. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw a profound empathy in her gray eyes. She saw his wound, not just the scar on his face, but the deeper one beneath, and she had not flinched. She had called it brave. In that small, firelit cottage, surrounded by the sound of the rain, the wall around Alistair's heart developed its first real crack. He was falling for the woman he was supposed to be testing, and he was beginning to fear that the person who would fail this test was not her, but himself. The lie he was living felt heavier than ever, a suffocating shroud that was preventing him from breathing the same air as this remarkable, compassionate woman. He had wanted to expose her greed, but instead he was discovering her grace, and in doing so, exposing the poverty of his own soul. He realized with a sickening lurch that he was beginning to care what she thought of him. Not the Duke, but Caleb, the scarred, cynical groundskeeper. And Caleb was a lie. The connection forged in the storm-swept cottage deepened in the weeks that followed. Their conversations in the garden grew longer, straying from horticulture to more personal territories. Alara spoke of her childhood home, of her love for her feckless but kind father, and the crushing weight of the responsibility she felt for her family's survival. She spoke of it all with a frankness, a lack of self-pity that Alistair found astonishing. She was not complaining about her fate. She was merely stating the facts of it. "Do you not resent him?" Caleb asked one afternoon, his voice carefully neutral as he staked a delphinium. "The Duke, forcing you into this arrangement." Alara paused, her trowel hovering over the soil. "I resent the circumstances that made it necessary," she said thoughtfully. "How can I resent a man I've never met? For all I know, he is as much a prisoner of his duty as I am of mine. I have heard the whispers, that he is a sad and lonely man. Perhaps he, too, is simply doing what he must." She looked at Caleb, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "We all wear masks to survive, don't we?" Her insight was so close to the truth it made his blood run cold. He felt like a fraud, a charlatan. Every kind word she offered him, every shared smile, was directed at a phantom. He was stealing her affection under false pretenses, and the guilt was becoming a physical ache in his chest. He found himself fantasizing about telling her the truth, about casting off the dirt-smudged clothes and revealing himself, but fear always held him back. The fear that she would look at him with the same betrayal he felt, that she would see only the Duke and the lie, and that the fragile, authentic connection he had with her as Caleb would be shattered forever. He was trapped in a prison of his own making. The midpoint of his self-imposed trial was marked by the arrival of his cousin, Lord Harrington. Harrington was everything Alistair was not: charming, debonair, and utterly transparent in his ambitions. He arrived in a flurry of polished leather and aristocratic noise, shattering the quiet peace of Blackwood Manor. Finch had been instructed to inform him that the Duke was still away, but Harrington, who was well aware of Alistair's reclusive tendencies and cynical nature, was immediately suspicious. He found Alara in the rose garden, and was instantly captivated by her quiet beauty and gentle dignity. He also found Caleb, his own cousin, dressed in servant's garb, his hands deep in the dirt. A slow, malicious smile spread across Harrington's face. He understood the game immediately. My, Harrington said, his voice dripping with condescension as he surveyed the garden. "Lady Alara, I had heard you were a diamond of the first water, but I see you have a penchant for rustic pursuits." His eyes flicked to Caleb. "And you keep robust company. Tell me, fellow, does His Grace pay you well enough to afford such a magnificent scowl?" Alistair's jaw tightened. He kept his head down, his knuckles white on the handle of his spade. "Well enough, M-Lord. You must be Caleb," Harrington continued, circling him like a predator. "I've heard so much about you. A veritable pillar of the community, Our Lady Alara's loyal shadow." He turned his smile on Alara. You must be careful, my dear. Loyalty in the lower classes is so often just a hunger for proximity to power. Alara's spine stiffened. She stepped forward, positioning herself subtly between Harrington and Caleb. Caleb has been an invaluable help to me, Lord Harrington, she said, her voice cool and clear, and a good friend. His integrity is worth more than the idle gossip of 100 London drawing rooms. Harrington laughed, a short, sharp sound. Indeed, such passion for a simple gardener. You have a generous heart, my lady. Perhaps too generous. The confrontation left a bitter taste in Alistair's mouth. Harrington's presence was a constant threat, a walking, talking embodiment of the world of lies and status he was trying to escape. Worse, his cousin began to court Alara in earnest. He brought her flowers, cut, Alistair noted with disgust, from a different part of the garden, read her poetry on the terrace, and filled the silent halls with his easy laughter. He was offering her the world she was supposed to want, the world of a peer. Alistair watched from the sidelines, a fire of jealousy burning in his gut. It was an agony unlike any he had ever known. He was jealous of Harrington's ability to sit with her at dinner, to speak with her as an equal, to openly admire her. He was the Duke of Blackwood, the master of all he surveyed, yet he was powerless, forced to watch another man woo the woman he was what? He couldn't even form the word in his own mind. The woman he was deceiving. The true test came one evening during a stroll. Harrington, with Alara on his arm, encountered Caleb clearing a fallen branch from the path. "Ah, the gardener," Harrington said loudly, still toiling away. A lesson in diligence for us all. He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a coin, flipping it in the air. "Here you are, my good man, for your troubles." The silver coin landed in the dirt at Alistair's feet. It was a calculated insult, a power play designed to humiliate him in front of Alara. For a heart-stopping moment, the Duke of Blackwood nearly rose up, the urge to smash his fist into his cousin's smug face almost overwhelming. But he caught Alara's eye. He saw the flash of outrage on her face, the tightening of her lips. Before he could react, she disengaged her arm from Harrington's. She bent down, picked up the coin herself, and pressed it firmly back into Harrington's palm. "I believe you dropped this, my lord," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. "Caleb is not a dog to be thrown scraps. He is a man, and he has more honor in his little finger than you seem to possess in your entire being. I will not stand here and watch you insult him, or me, by assuming I would find such cruelty amusing." She turned, her back ramrod straight, and walked away without a second glance. Harrington stood stunned for a moment, then let out a low chuckle and pocketed the coin. "Feisty," he murmured to himself, before turning to follow her. Alistair remained frozen, the spade forgotten in his hand. She had defended him. She had chosen the honor of a poor groundskeeper over the favor of a wealthy lord. She had looked at a direct representation of the aristocratic power she supposedly craved and rejected it in favor of simple human decency. The foundation of his entire deception, the core belief that she was only after his title, crumbled into dust. She didn't want the title. She wanted the man. And the man she was falling for wasn't him. It was Caleb, a ghost, a lie. The realization was not a triumph, but a tragedy. In trying to unmask her, he had only succeeded in building a mask so convincing that he was now trapped behind it, in love with a woman who loved a man who didn't exist. The weight of his choice pressed down on him, suffocating and absolute. He had won his wager with himself, and in doing so had lost everything. The days following her defense of him were filled with a new, poignant sweetness that was almost unbearable for Alistair. The pretense between them had melted away, replaced by an easy companionship. They worked side by side in the resurrected garden, which was now beginning to show signs of vibrant life. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. For Alara, these were moments of pure, unadulterated happiness. She was falling in love with Caleb, the quiet, wounded man who saw the world with such sad, beautiful eyes. She loved his strong, calloused hands, the rare, slow smile that transformed his face, and the deep well of kindness he tried so hard to hide. The thought of the Duke's eventual return was a distant storm cloud on the horizon of her perfect summer. For Alistair, every shared laugh was a turn of the knife. Her affection was a gift he hadn't earned and couldn't accept. He was living a stolen life, and the bill would soon come due. The lie was a living thing now, a serpent coiled around his heart, squeezing tighter with each passing day. He knew he had to end it, but he couldn't bear the thought of the look in her eyes when she learned the truth. One warm, moonlit evening, they lingered in the garden long after the other staff had retired. A night-blooming jasmine had opened, filling the air with its intoxicating perfume. They stood near the stone bench, not touching, but the space between them hummed with a palpable energy. "It's beautiful," Alara whispered, looking up at the sky, so full of stars. "I never thought I could feel at peace here, but I do. With you." She turned to look at him, her face luminous in the moonlight. Her eyes were wide and trusting, full of an emotion that made his heart ache with a terrible combination of joy and despair. All the carefully constructed walls, all the cynical defenses he had spent years building were gone. There was only this woman, and the truth he was terrified to tell her. He took a step closer, his hand coming up as if to touch her cheek, then hesitating. "Ilara," he began, his voice rough with unshed emotion. She closed the distance between them, her gaze never leaving his. "It's all right, Caleb," she whispered, as if she could sense the turmoil inside him. She mistook his conflict for fear of their difference in station. "It doesn't matter." And then she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a soft, questioning touch. But for Alistair it was a cataclysm. Every lie, every deception, every cynical thought was burned away in the pure, honest heat of her mouth on his. He forgot he was a duke, a master, a judge. He was just a man, starved for a connection he never believed he would find. His arms went around her, pulling her close, deepening the kiss with all the desperate, pent-up yearning that had been building for weeks. He poured all his unspoken truths into that single, breathless moment. His admiration, his regret, his burgeoning love. When they finally broke apart, they were both trembling. Alara rested her forehead against his chest, her breathing unsteady. "Caleb?" She breathed his name like a prayer, and the sound of it broke him. He was Caleb to her. The man she had just given her heart to was a fiction. The guilt was a physical sickness, rising in his throat. He couldn't do it. He couldn't let this go on for another second. He had to tell her. "Alara," he said, his voice cracking, "I am not." But before he could utter the confession, a voice cut through the darkness. "There you are, my lady. I've been looking all over for you." It was Finch. He stood at the edge of the garden, holding a lantern high. His face was pale, his expression grim. "There is a letter from your father. It is urgent." The spell was broken. Alara pulled away from him, her face flushing as she realized they'd been seen. "My father?" she asked, a thread of alarm in her voice. She cast one last, confused look at Caleb before hurrying towards the steward. Alistair stood alone in the moonlight, his heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He had almost told her. He had been on the precipice. The interruption felt like both a reprieve and a curse. He watched her disappear into the great house, the light from Finch's lantern swallowed by the shadows. He had a terrible, premonitory feeling that he had just lost his last chance to tell her the truth himself. The storm he had been avoiding was about to break, and he would be at its merciless center. The letter was not from her father. It was a summons. Finch, his face a mask of pained duty, led her not to her chambers, but towards the one place she had been forbidden to go, the Duke's private wing. "Finch, what is this?" Alara asked, her unease growing with every step. The air in this part of the manor was different, charged with a latent energy. "You said the Duke was away." "His Grace has returned, my lady," Finch said. his eyes fixed on the ornate doors ahead of them. He wishes to see you. Now. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. The Duke. After all this time, he was here. The man whose title she had spoken of with such cold practicality. The faceless entity who held her future in his hands. All thoughts of Caleb fled, replaced by a wave of pure dread. She smoothed her dress, her hands trembling slightly. She had been so lost in her idyll with the groundskeeper, she had almost forgotten the true purpose of her presence here. Finch opened the doors to a vast, book-lined study. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, a roaring fire casting dancing shadows across the room. A man stood with his back to her, staring into the flames. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture rigid with tension. He was dressed not in rough-spun, but in a perfectly tailored coat of dark blue velvet. "Your Grace," Finch announced softly, and then retreated, closing the doors behind him with a quiet, final click. Alara's mouth went dry. She curtsied, her eyes fixed on the man's back. "Your Grace," she murmured. "You wish to see me." He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackle and hiss of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, but it was a voice she knew with every fiber of her being. "Alara." He turned slowly. The world tilted on its axis. Time seemed to slow, to stretch, to splinter into 1,000 sharp, glittering shards of disbelief. It was Caleb's face. The same strong jaw, the same dark, unruly hair, the same startlingly blue eyes. But the dirt was gone, the rough clothes replaced by the raiment of a nobleman. And the scar, the familiar, intimate scar she had traced with her own eyes, was no longer the mark of a common brawler, but the flaw in the otherwise perfect mask of Alistair, the 8th Duke of Blackwood. She stared at him, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The garden, the cottage, the shared words, the healing of his arm, the kiss, it was all him, every moment, every lie. Caleb. The name was a ghost on her lips, a sound of profound confusion and dawning horror. "There is no Caleb," he said, and the words were like stones, hard and cold. "There is only me." The blood drained from her face. The betrayal was so immense, so complete. It left no room for anger, only a vast, empty chasm of pain. He had not just lied about his name. He had lied about his essence. He had stood by, day after day, and watched her, judged her, tested her. He had allowed her to pour out her heart to a fiction, to a servant who did not exist, all while he, the Duke, was weighing her worth. The conversation she'd had with Agnes echoed in her mind. I must secure that title. He had heard her. He had believed the worst of her from the very beginning. "The garden," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Our talks, your arm." "It was a test," he admitted, his own voice raw with a self-loathing that was a miserable counterpoint to her pain. "I had to know if you were like the others, if you only wanted the title." "And what did your test prove, your Grace?" she asked, the formal address a deliberate, cutting cruelty. Her shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a glacial fury. She drew herself up, her spine like iron. The powerless girl who had arrived at his gates was gone. In her place was a woman who had been played for a fool, and who would not be broken by it. "Did it prove that I was foolish enough to care for a man who did not exist? Did it prove that you are a coward, hiding behind masks and games because you are too afraid to meet someone honestly, face to face?" Her words hit him harder than any physical blow. "Alara, No." She cut him off, her voice sharp and clear. "You will not speak my name. You have no right. I was a curiosity to you, an insect to be pinned to a board and studied. You stood by and let me fall in love with a lie. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, but she did not bother to wipe it away. It was a testament to her pain, and she would not hide it from him. Well, you have your answer. I do not want your title. I want nothing from you. I will be gone by morning." She turned, her movements stiff and precise, and walked towards the door. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. Don't go. I was wrong. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, but she did not turn around. Yes, you were, she said, her voice utterly devoid of warmth. You were wrong to think I could be bought. And you were wrong to think my heart was a thing to be toyed with for your own amusement. Goodbye, Your Grace. She opened the door and walked out, leaving him alone in the magnificent, firelit study. The room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken truths. He had set out to prove she was hollow, and had discovered she was the only real thing in his world. And he had just destroyed her. The silence she left behind was absolute, a perfect mirror of the desolate wasteland that was now his heart. Alara did not weep. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot in her chest, a feeling of such profound violation that it numbed her. She moved through her opulent chambers with a detached efficiency, packing her few belongings into the same worn satchel she had arrived with. Agnes fluttered around her, her face a mess of confusion and distress, but Alara did not have the words to explain the monstrous nature of the Duke's deception. How could she explain that the man who had broken her heart and the man who owned this castle were one and the same? She was not just leaving Blackwood Manor. She was leaving a dream, a foolish, impossible dream that a man like Caleb could exist, and that he could love her. The reality was so much crueler. The man she had loved was a phantom, and the man who was real was a monster of cynicism and deceit. She had been right all along. This was a transaction. But she would not be the goods exchanged. Her dignity, she realized with a surge of fierce pride, was her own. It was not for sale, not for any price, not for any title. She would go home. She would face the ruin of her family with her head held high. It was better to live in an honest hovel than a palace built on lies. For Alistair, the night was an eternity of torment. He paced the study like a caged animal, the echo of her final words, "Goodbye, Your Grace," replaying endlessly in his mind. He saw his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The Duke of Blackwood, a man of immense power and wealth, a man who had everything and nothing. He had protected his heart so fiercely that he had killed it. He had believed love was a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited. Alara had shown him it was a strength, a form of bravery. She had offered him that bravery, and he had thrown it back in her face. The irony was corrosive. He, who had been so terrified of being wanted only for his title, had created a situation where she had fallen for a man with no title at all. He had gotten everything he could have ever wanted, a woman who saw the man, not the Duke, and he had achieved it through a lie so profound it had annihilated any possibility of a future. When dawn broke, gray and unforgiving, he knew what he had to do. It was not enough to apologize. Words were meaningless now. He had proven himself a master of false ones. He needed to act. He needed to make a gesture so unequivocal, so selfless, that it might, just might, begin to atone for the damage he had done. He summoned Finch, his face haggard in the morning light. His orders were precise, and they caused the stoic steward's eyebrows to rise in astonishment. For the first time in years, the Duke of Blackwood was not retreating from the world, but striding out to meet it head-on. Alara's carriage was halfway down the long, winding drive when it was stopped. A rider was approaching at a full gallop, his dark coat flying behind him. It was the Duke. Her heart seized in her chest. She ordered the driver to continue, but Alistair rode his horse directly into their path, forcing them to a halt. He dismounted, his movements urgent. He was no longer the immaculate Duke from the study, nor the rough groundskeeper from the garden. He was simply a man, his face etched with desperation and sleeplessness. He came to the carriage door, but he did not open it. He spoke to her through the window. "Alara, I know you have no reason to listen to me," he began, his voice strained, "but I am begging you for 5 minutes of your time. Not as the Duke, as the man who was a fool." She stared at him, her expression unyielding. "You have had weeks of my time under false pretenses. I have nothing more to give you." "I know," he said, his hand resting on the door, his knuckles white. "I know I don't deserve it, but I did not ride after you to ask for your forgiveness, because I have not yet earned the right to ask. I came to give you this." He held up a thick vellum packet, sealed with his ducal crest. "These are the deeds to your father's estate. I have bought them out of receivership. They are yours free and clear. All of his debts have been settled. There are no conditions, no marriage contract, nothing. Your family is secure. You are free." Alara stared at the documents, her mind reeling. This was what she had come here for, the very thing she had been willing to sacrifice herself to achieve. And he was just giving it to her. "Why?" she whispered, the single word encompassing all her confusion. "Because my test was a monstrous cruelty, but it taught me one thing," he said, his blue eyes locking onto hers, raw and vulnerable. "It taught me that your family's security was a duty to you, not an ambition. You were willing to sacrifice your happiness for their well-being. I will not allow that sacrifice to have been in vain. And I will not hold you to a bargain that was brokered in bad faith by me." He took a step back from the carriage. "You don't have to marry me, Alara. You never have to see me again. But you will not go home to ruin. I will not allow the consequences of my arrogance to destroy you and your family." He placed the packet on the seat beside the driver. "Go home, Lady Alara. Be safe. Be happy." He turned and walked back to his horse without another word. His shoulders slumped not with ducal authority, but with the profound weight of his regret. He mounted and rode away, back toward the cold, empty fortress of Blackwood Manor, leaving her sitting in the carriage, the proof of her freedom in her hands, her world once again turned completely upside down. He had given her everything she thought she wanted, and in doing so had shown her the one thing she now realized she could not bear to live without him. The real him, the flawed, repentant, honorable man who had just set her free at the cost of his own happiness. The journey home was a blur. Alara sat in the swaying carriage, the packet of deeds resting in her lap like a lead weight. She was free. Her father was safe. The crushing burden that had shaped her entire adult life had been lifted. She should have been euphoric, triumphant. Instead, she felt hollowed out, as if some vital part of her had been amputated. She kept replaying his final act in her mind. It was not the gesture of a manipulative tyrant. It was an act of profound, selfless penance. He had stripped away his own power, removing the one hold he had over her. He had asked for nothing in return. In that single moment on the road, he had proven he was not the cold-hearted cynic he pretended to be. He was the man she had glimpsed in the firelit cottage, the man who called trust brave even after being betrayed. He was the man who had instinctively thrown himself in front of a falling stone to protect her. He was both Caleb and the Duke, a tangled, wounded, and honorable man. By the time she reached the dilapidated gates of her family home, she knew what she had to do. She had spent weeks restoring a neglected garden, bringing life back to a place that had been abandoned. Perhaps a heart could be tended in the same way. She found her father in his study, a look of bewildered relief on his face as he read through the documents she presented. "I don't understand, Alara," he said, peering at her over his spectacles. "The Duke of Blackwood has settled everything? With no marriage? Why?" "Because he is a better man than I gave him credit for, father," she said softly. "And because I was a fool," she kissed his cheek. "I have to go back." "Back?" he cried in alarm. "But you are free of him." "No," she said, a quiet certainty settling over her. "I am free to choose. And I choose him." Alistair did not expect to ever see her again. He resigned himself to a life of solitude, the halls of Blackwood Manor echoing with the ghosts of what might have been. He spent his days in the rose garden, tending to the bushes she had brought back to life. It was his penance, his only connection to her. He worked with his own hands, feeling the thorns prick his skin, welcoming the small, sharp pain as a reminder of his folly. One afternoon, a week after she had left, he looked up from his work to see her standing at the edge of the garden. She was not dressed as a grand lady, but in the same simple muslin dress she had worn when they first met. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating, that his grief had conjured her image. She walked towards him, her steps sure and steady. She stopped just before him, her gray eyes searching his face. "The garden is looking well," she said, her voice quiet. "I've been trying to keep up with it," he managed to say, his voice thick. "You have dirt on your face?" she noted, a faint smile touching her lips. She reached up, and with a hesitant finger, she wiped a smudge from his cheek. Her touch was electric, a spark of life in his desolate world. "Elara," he breathed her name, his heart aching with a hope he was terrified to embrace. "Why are you here?" "I gave you your freedom." "You gave me my family's security," she corrected him gently. "My freedom is my own to give. And I am giving it to you, Alistair." It was the first time she had used his true name. Sounded both strange and wonderful. "I don't deserve it," he said, his voice raw. "After what I did. The lies. The lies were born of a deep wound, I think," she said, her gaze falling to the scar on his face. "You were hurt, so you decided to hurt first. You built walls to protect yourself. I do not love you for those walls. I love you in spite of them. I fell in love with a man I called Caleb. A man who was kind, and sad, and brave. A man who tried to hide his good heart beneath a gruff exterior. That man is you. The title, the wealth, that is just the soil you are planted in. It is not the flower." Tears welled in his eyes, the first he had shed since he was a boy. He had been so wrong, so blind. He had searched for greed and found grace. "I love you, Elara Vance," he said, the words torn from the very depths of his soul. "Not as a duchess, not as a bargain, as the woman who taught a fool how to feel again. Will you marry me?" "Not the Duke. Me. Alistair." "Yes," she whispered, her own eyes shining. "Yes, Alistair. I will." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of earth and rain and her. Felt like coming home. It was not a victory of a duke claiming his duchess, but the quiet, triumphant joining of two lonely souls who had found each other through a maze of pain and deception. Their wedding was a small, private affair, held not in the grand ballroom of the manor, but in the heart of the rose garden they had restored together. They spoke their vows under an archway of blooming white roses, their hands clasped together, his strong and scarred, hers gentle and capable. They were not a duke and his purchased bride, but a man and a woman, choosing each other on terms of pure, unvarnished truth. In the years that followed, Blackwood Manor was transformed. Laughter echoed in the once silent halls. The fires were always lit, and the gardens bloomed with a riot of color. The Duke was no longer a recluse, and his Duchess was beloved by all for her kindness and grace. They built a life not on status or wealth, but on the bedrock of a hard-won trust. Often, they would walk in the rose garden in the evenings, and Alistair would take her hand, his touch a constant, reassuring presence. He had begun his journey seeking to expose a falsehood and had ended by discovering the most profound truth of his life. That true love was not about finding a perfect person, but about having the courage to see and be seen, imperfections and all. In the quiet triumph of their shared life, the scarred duke and the penniless lady had found a home in each other's hearts.